Now, without much further ado, it gives me great pleasure to bring up our next moderator, who will be speaking on how we can actively navigate to net zero in delivery buildings for people and the planet as a whole. Please join me and make welcome a senior project manager at Turner and Townsend, Chuka Azinge. He'll moderate this panel conversation. Please let's applaud Chuka. I know that we've just had lunch and we might be a bit tired, but with the applause, we need some energy, energy, energy. Thank you very much. Please make welcome Chuka. He'll come up stage to bring up other members of this conversation. Thank you very much, Chuka, and we do hope that this conversation is truly insightful. Thank you. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope we're all not worn down by the amazing lunch provided by our sponsors. Today we have a very interesting, poignant discussion today, and I'll just make briefly introductions of the panelists we have to unpack the topic of discussion. So firstly, I'd like to call on Dylan Govinda, Associate Director of Turner and Townsend, to come on stage, please. Round of applause, please. Thank you. Secondly, we have the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Green Building Council of Nigeria, Yemi Olayiwola. Thirdly, we have Anrinu, who's the Head of Property, West Africa and Nigeria for Standard Chartered Bank. Applause, please. Thank you. And we also have on the panel today one of the foremost sustainability consultants in Nigeria currently, Emmanuel Falade, CEO of Laterz. And finally, giving us the perspective from the contractor, we have Cesar Tayun, who's the lead and edge specialist for ITB Nigeria. Hey. Okay. Right, so good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to this session. With the backdrop of the ongoing COP27 conference in Egypt, and I've heard it reference the past couple of discussions we had, where climate change, sustainability, and the transition to net zero are at the forefront of current affairs globally. I think it underlines the importance, the relevance, and without trying to sensationalize or exaggerate the topic, I think it highlights clearly that this is a very time-sensitive topic to speak on, and we need an action plan in place to reverse some of the climate change that we're seeing around globally. The topic of discussion today is navigating to net zero. It means different things to different people. It's a concept thrown around, and today we would like to unpack exactly what this means from different perspectives and deep dive into the conversation. In recent years, I would say there's been a gradual shift in the West African region, where sustainability in all of its forms is moving from a nice to have to more of a priority within the built environment, especially for those seeking to future-proof their assets. And I have here with me a a most distinguished panel, thought leaders in their own rights. And like I said earlier, they'll be helping unpack this particular topic as we aim to take a deep dive into the challenges, the cost, and the opportunities associated with navigating to net zero. Like I said, I think we'll start up the conversation by looking at net zero from different perspectives. I think sustainability is one of the most commonly used phrases at this point in our word in construction. And we hear about green buildings, navigating to net zero, and oftentimes these concepts are used interchangeably. So what I would like to firstly ask, I suppose I'll start with Dylan on this question, is what does net zero mean to you from the perspective of a consultant? And what are your thoughts on it?
Good afternoon all, and can I just say it's an absolute pleasure to be invited to the WAPI conference, and it's my first visit to Nigeria and I'm absolutely loving it. In terms of what are my thoughts on net zero, I'd like to show the vision of the business from Turner and Townsend, in that we have a motto of making a difference, transforming performance to a greener, inclusive and productive world. And what does that mean? It means that we're all on a journey to live sustainably and ensure that we have a world for the future, a future for our kids and our family. So we know that the world is heating up to 1.5 degrees, and that we need to do something to control that journey. And it's the steps that we take now that ensures a brighter future for all. We'll come to this later in our discussion in terms of, yes, there is a cost that's associated with it, but we have to ask ourselves, what is the true cost of non-compliance or not doing anything? And that's always the fundamental that we always look at when we talk about the journey towards net zero.
Thanks, Dylan. I think you've actually set the scene for the tone of conversations as we would be having it throughout this discussion session. And would you like to add any thoughts on that as well?
I will. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone in the room. It's really great to be here talking about a very important subject that affects everyone in the world. Simply put, net zero, what it means to me, removing as much CO2 as we produce to limiting global warming. I think if we go away just thinking about that, it means we all have a responsibility and accountability as far as reaching net zero is concerned. And it's important to also set the context about countries and cities and companies are increasingly committing to reaching a net zero by 2050. At Standard Chartered Bank, we have a journey which we started in 2017 and have a roadmap towards 2050 by which we plan to have reached net zero as an organization. We have adopted a bold stance, sustainability as one, focused on an integrated approach towards net zero. But if you ask me the question personally, what does net zero mean to me? It means being passionate about the environment, connecting businesses through various mediums. This conversation we're having in the room today, looking at the opportunities that my bank, Standard Chartered Bank, offers from funding and financing, and leveraging on that towards ensuring that we have a global reach around addressing net zero. So it also means to me being accountable and responsible for the future of the next generation, of our great-grandchildren unborn. I mean, I think the story is already real in our faces. So it's not about a far-fetched story. Half of Nigeria was fiscally underwater through floodings in the last few years. So reaching net zero really is critical to me, and I think to you and everyone in this room. We're all accountable for that. And also, I think it means doing something and not sitting still or standing still. The world hit a 8 million population, according to the UN today, in today's news. And so that sort of tells a real story for us that we are all accountable and responsible for working, navigating towards net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for that as well. And I think it would also lead us into the segue that I'll come to later on some of the challenges you're facing as Standard Chartered in, achieving net zero within the climate we find ourselves in Nigeria. But I'd just also like to give Yemi a chance to speak on this as well. Yemi, I'm aware that you're a director in the Green Building Council, so there's definitely passion behind the advocacy that you're behind. So can you just give us a few thoughts on what net zero means to you and some of the vision you're aiming to achieve with the Green Building Council in Nigeria?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Chuka. Thank you to everyone present here this afternoon. So the big word, net zero, is, I think, to break it down to what most people would be conversant with, because I think a lot of us are more familiar with the term sustainability. But net zero, pretty much like Anne said, taking out CO2, but in addition to that is a combination of greenhouse gases, and I'd say that is doing more of feasible reductions, particularly as it pertains to what we do at the Green Building Council, which has to do with construction, buildings, basically infrastructure. So to ensure that most of what we do, or our approach in terms of policy, is to focus on reduction, from source, particularly at the point of manufacturing, particularly with supply chain. Earlier there was a session that focused on logistics. These are all the things that add up, particularly towards emissions globally, and Nigeria is not left out. Also, another thing is removing as much as possible the amount of emissions that is currently in the atmosphere. So we're also looking at encouraging people to rather retrofit rather than always having to do new builds. What can you reuse? How can you reduce? How can you recycle? And how can you upcycle? So these are a whole lot of, I'm sure people would say we're throwing so much terminologies around, but these are what we're looking at and helping and advocating for, particularly with the Green Building Council, and to ensure that whatever pledges we're making, as stakeholders in this room, we can all, work together to be able to achieve this net zero commitment.
Thank you very much, Yemi, for that as well. And just looking to bring the context of navigating to net zero, to more real estate focused and more construction focused, so to speak, because we know net zero applies to all industries, all walks of life, and all ways of life. So I'll just come to you, Emmanuel. You do consultancy work in terms of sustainability, you advise clients, advise contractors. What does that mean to you, and what has been the feedback in your consultancy for clients to achieve sustainability?
All right, thank you, Chuka. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying that we should know that we did not inherit the earth from our parents, we borrowed it from our children. So what that meant is that there is a commitment to presenting to our future yet unborn what the earth that is good should look like. That's number one. Number two, also in real estate assessment, most of the most prized or well-priced assets are within the coastal cities or coastal regions. So what that meant is that with people or with companies, with industries not focusing on net zero and sustainability, it's possible that with a single event, like what happened in Nigeria recently, a lifelong investment of persons and companies can be wiped out by a single action. So what this is to us is that we are not only responsible because we want to preserve our children, we're also responsible for what will happen to our investment. So what does it mean to us as at the level of consulting? Now, looking at the index that make up this net zero, a process, a design methodology that adapt this also helps to preserve your pocket. Because in retrospect, we are not only doing this to prevent the environment, we're also doing this to reduce construction costs and operational costs. So what we're saying is that this whole contest is not only economical, it's not only environmental, it is economical, and it's also posterity centered. So let me conclude by saying to us that the journey to net zero is not a Western thing like we used to thought about it. I'd had conversation with clients that would tell me we don't have, this is not Haiti, this is not America, we don't have tornadoes, we don't have this in Nigeria, in West Africa. But trust me, what we are having in recent time, and also because we have a system that doesn't back up itself. We don't have viable mortgage, we don't have viable insurance system. So that means we are responsible for what happened to our investment and to our projects. By adapting and embracing net zero processes and practices, we have a very high chance of preserving our assets, giving them higher value, and also presenting something tangible to people yet unborn. Thank you, Chuka.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And I think you touched on a few things that are really running through the theme of our discussion today. You touched on the cost of it, is it economical or not? You touched on contractors, making it even, a cost-saving measure for them as well. So I also like at this point to give Caesar the opportunity to speak on what net zero means to a contractor, because the way I look at it, I think you are the forefront, you're the front line of the construction industry. I'm aware that ITB has actually delivered LEED certified buildings, so I know that you're taking an active interest in pursuing sustainable modes of construction. So what does that mean to you and ITB as a contractor? Is there a conscious effort that you're making to ensure that all your practices are sustainable?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. First, let me tell you that the construction sector is accountable for 40% of energy consumption. Hence, the key factor of building green, going more sustainable, to reduce our emissions and our energy consumption. From ITV perspective and contractors, we are always keen to build in a sustainable way, even before knowing about LEED and EDGE and adopting all these certification programs. We build our towers in a way to save energy. As from commercial part, commercial view, we save on our bills. We also tell our clients that we can improve your ROI since your bills are less. Tenants can be attracted. You have higher values, rental values. So for us, it's essential to, since the beginning of the project, to put a plan, tell our client what we can offer for him, and follow this plan to actually reach our goals in saving and reducing our consumption.
Thank you very much, and I hope that, because this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I hope that you carry on being leaders, and showing your peers that this is actually the way forward, this is the best way to go, because it affects everyone evenly. So, Anna, I'd just like to return to you as we start looking at some of the challenges that face us in navigating or transitioning to net zero in the Nigerian context or the West African context. From a corporate organizational point of view, as a company like Standard Chartered that have goals and visions to make this transition, in your experience, what are some of the major challenges you're currently facing to achieving net zero in Nigeria and West Africa at large?
Thank you very much for that question, Chuka. I think as a corporate, when you sort of sit in an isolated space, achieving net zero by 2015 must be very overwhelming. Overwhelming because we're contesting against the challenges globally, economic challenges, and I want to draw it down to Nigeria. But I think the reality is that we need to sort of start by defining a commitment towards it. I will talk about the challenges, and I'll use the SCB story, if you would permit me, because I think it then helps you bring it home, and it helps you recognize that it is achievable, and it means that you can actually have a template of sorts towards it. So I start by saying it's overwhelming, but there are great opportunities towards the direction of net zero. You know, we need to first of all start by prioritizing our commitments towards the sustainability agenda. There's no one size that fits all, but I think the key thing is start off with a roadmap that is driven by developing the environment, social goals, the ESG goals. So it's just understanding what it means to your organization to break down the challenges. You know, so having prioritized, defined a roadmap and setting targets that reduce carbon emissions, you begin a journey. And I will use that by setting my story. First of all, we're all on a learning curve. It's not necessarily new to us, but getting there is new to everyone. I did start off by saying that we adopt an integrated approach such that sustainability is part of our decision making as an organization. And when you begin to think about it in that way, it makes more sense. It makes more business sense. As part of the organization, I have clear set targets in terms of how many tons. I think this year I have a target of 3,000 tons of carbon emission that I must reduce. So every part of the business actually needs to work and fit in that way. So in achieving that, we clearly need to invest. And I think that often is the big question for corporates. We have other priorities in terms of where and what to invest in. But I think the good news is that because it's one of the biggest conversations globally, there's a lot of investment available and financing and funding for sustainable development, right through to dedicated SME funding, to green bonds and various sort of investments, which I will touch on very briefly. But let me just focus on a building typically and what you need to think about. You know, many of us have generators in our offices because we still haven't gone to 100% renewable energy. When last did you conduct an assessment of your generator load? Is it operating full capacity? And, you know, is it efficient, and what do you need to do around those things? So right sizing your generators, your UPSs, right down to load shedding, thinking about it. I think quite many of us were forced during recent times in Nigeria when we started having issues with the power transmission to rethink 24/7 power. Of course, for data centers, you need to provide that through alternative power. But many homes, many commercial and corporates had to start rethinking the number of hours they left their power operating. So we've talked around recycling, which waste management. It's all part of the whole reduction conversation. So looking at your plastics, in Standard Chartered Bank, we operate a single-use plastic. So we try as much to avoid plastics being used in our buildings. And that's really everything that we use, we recycle. We reuse as much as possible. Then let's talk about the greater aspects of energy efficiency. So LED lighting across today, it's just the way, it's almost the lifestyle in quotes, to have this sort of things. Having LED controls with photosensors, so your lights come on only when they need to come on, right down to looking at power purchase agreements that we can have with the various energy suppliers, so we were one of the first banks, for example, that completed an agreement with Victoria Power suppliers and Lagos State in providing dedicated power transmission to our buildings. And by extension, it means that we have almost a guaranteed minimum power arrangement from the grid. And those things begin to speak to how best we minimize the use of our generators, for example, which in turn reduces our carbon emissions. So there are actually methodology in calculating the emission reductions, and these examples I've shared with you goes into that. And we even look at our fleets, for example. We encourage fleet servicing, so not everyone is bringing their cars in. As part of the bank's policy around travel, for every travel you make, we record the carbon emissions through the aeroplanes. And in Nigeria in particular, one of the things we've introduced is that for every visitor into the bank who makes a trip, commits to planting a tree. So there is there clearly so much to be done towards the reduction of pollution and carbon emissions in the air. So I move away from sort of sharing some of our stories there to talking about some of the challenges that plagues organizations really. You think about how do you prioritize it against your organization's expectations in terms of financial expectations, securing funding. I mean, I can talk to you about some of the funds that are available. We've got a sustainability financing business within the bank as an example. So to that extent, you could leverage on dedicated funds for SMEs, dedicated funds for microfinance institutions. We can actually even look at funds for corporates who have a real need to actually go through the journey of carbon emission reduction. Again, I mean, I think the other important thing that is a challenge is knowledge. I feel that the knowledge of even the simple practical things that organizations can do, which guarantees their energy performance and efficiency, is really out there now. So it's really being part of the movement that really can get as much information out that is out there. I was at Ehibet in Lagos State the other day, and their development plan speaks quite clearly towards sustainability and some of the SDG goals that they're trying to achieve. I can sort of go on in terms of those challenges, but I think what we must be speaking to is turning those challenges into real opportunities and the opportunity cost of life in the next 20 years, as it were. And I think that is perhaps the right way to look at it. So the corporates need to start by setting net zero targets. There are tools, as I explained. They need to begin to pledge towards how they would reach that target and then commence the journey. And it's a continuum in a journey because, of course, as you reduce, you can actually also begin to create other solutions towards it. As a classic example, so part of my targets this year, I'm not necessarily able to meet some of it. So what do? I go out and I buy renewable energy certificates. And that means that I've paid towards my carbon emissions in the country. So other corporates may not necessarily be able to afford to do that, but those opportunities are out there such that you become carbon free by your target timelines of 2015. I'd like to stop there, but I can continue.
Thank you very much. And I think you've set out really the scene really for how we're going to follow up the conversations. And from what I pick from some of those challenges you're facing, firstly is about cost. Secondly is about specifications in terms of design, the right materials that should be installed within facilities. And thirdly really is behavioral. To see how we can get educated, unlearn certain things we knew before, and learn new ways to adapt to the changing world. So just on the first, and I believe it's probably the most poignant of the points. It's on the cost to transition. Oftentimes we hear clients and developers alike, using cost as an excuse. Maybe excuse is a strong word, but maybe as a reason, why they can't make this transition. So I suppose I can hand over to Dylan to just speak on the age-old question. Is the cost really prohibitive?
Thanks, Shuka. I think I agree with your comments that it's probably the most misconstrued concept, that often there's a branding of sustainable projects being, oh, it's too expensive to do. My project can never survive on a commercial base in implementing sustainable solutions. How do we solve this problem? And the fundamental of doing this is to understand data and look at benchmarking and to understand where are we as an industry in the real estate sector, and how do we look at the principles of what we are doing today and to build a more sustainable future. As part of my role as a quantity surveyor within the business and the lead of life cycle costing, we often have whole life cycle costing models. And part of our exercise that we do is that we often dispel the notion that building green costs extra. Yes, we all know that for you to install a PV panel on your roof will cost more money than if you did it. But let's look at it from an operational and a CapEx perspective. I think we all hear about the iceberg effect, and we know that, and what happened to the Titanic, where CapEx, if you could look at it, is the tip of the iceberg on the top. But the real cost, or the real cost of non-transforming into a sustainable future, is what lies beneath. So can you really say that an additional 10, 20% additional CapEx cost has an overruling impact on you using sustainable technologies of your future? And I think it's also the outlook of investors and property owners that, yes, we have an investment that we need to do. But what is your outlook? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Further on to that, I'd just like to, there's also a sort of a misconception in terms of net zero when it comes to an organizational rating for net zero as a net zero specific to a building. We often get clients that come to us and say, please can I pay you an X value and make my building net zero. Net zero is not a once-off. It's a process. It's continuously have to implement your design solutions over the long term. So one cannot install a costly BMS system up front just to disconnect it after there's problems after year 1 or year 2. I think we mentioned earlier on that the purpose of net zero is to reduce our carbon footprint in the world. And I think we all know that energy is the fundamental impact when it comes to the journey towards net zero. And part of this involves carbon. So there's 3 areas that we look at in terms of carbon. We have embodied carbon, where we look at what are the materials that go into a particular building, and where we look at carbon that's embedded into concrete and into bricks, into all of your materials that are into a building. So what we do as a business, we've developed a carbon embodied calculator to enable developers to understand your design direction, how much of carbon you are actually using from an embodied basis. We model an operational carbon within your model, which enables you as a developer or a landowner to understand your design direction that you need to go towards and where your reductions need to be. I think we understand that we cannot offset all of our carbon, and as Anne had mentioned, that there are means to offset this via carbon capture or carbon credits that we can purchase from the market. There is a value that we put on this at the moment. We call this a shadow rating or shadow cost of carbon. And as you know, this cost is ever increasing year on year. So the power is upon us to look at alternative energies to drive this forward. So how does this relate to the Nigerian market? And I think there is a journey towards this. I think the recent mega inflation towards diesel costs have really spurred the investments into PV implementation within the nation, where more and more buildings are looking at these technologies to not only provide energy, but to also reduce the carbon impact onto the environment. So the journey is started, but I think there needs to be a fundamental and a proactive way of putting further investment into renewable energies, as well as reaching out to government institutions for assistance and support to mitigate their initial upfront capex variance. As an example, in South Africa, where I'm part of the Turner and Townsend business, we have tax rebates which you can claim back against your renewable investment initiatives. So much like that, it reduces the burden upon investors to transform their business or their real estate assets to be more inclusive, greener, and productive.
Thank you very much, Dylan. I think you touched on a very important point that I'd like to hamper on now. I know a speaker before this panel had asked, that one of the major stakeholders for probably the cuts across all of the panel discussions is missing, which is the government. And, Dylan, you spoke about design solutions in terms of, concrete reducing the carbon footprint that can be linked to this transition to net zero. I suppose the next question I'll pose would be to Yemi. What are the current policies in place, government policies, whether it may be laws, it may be guidance within the building code that actually speak to sustainability?
Thanks, Chuka. I'd say in the current building code in Nigeria, I don't think, so we have the energy efficiency code. That's been ongoing for a couple of years now. But I think in itself, the code in itself is sustainable, but it doesn't really say sustainability. So what I mean is maybe you're looking at your daylight, adequate fenestrations, just a basic traditional tropical architecture, so to say, strategies. So I know currently in Nigeria there's work majorly in the energy efficiency sector, renewables as well. There are a whole lot of ongoing work on that, particularly when it comes to alternative energy sources and all of that, but not anything in particular as we get to policy. And right. I think that's one of the major obstacles in terms of challenges to achieving sustainability or even transitioning to net zero as a way in this environment, because if the major partner, the major stakeholder, the big brother is not looking at these things, it's very hard to sell it to the end users, the developers, the investors, because people need to begin to make sense of it. How does it make naira and kobo value to me at the end of it? Because like Dylan said, to build sustainable is not cheap. To offset your carbon and buy renewable credits like Anne is doing at Standard Chartered is not cheap, somebody, you have to take the deliberate effort, but you also need someone to hold your hand and say, this is the way to do it. So again, as a body, the council can do that, but the major driver has to be the government. And I would like to add that at the Green Building Council Nigeria right now, we'll put together a team that is doing intense research work, looking at how to really begin to look at ways that we can localize what we have in terms of green buildings, sustainability, and eventually how we can achieve net zero or navigate towards net zero as a country. So again, this is not a short-term goal for us. It's something that we would work on, we would discuss with the stakeholders, we would sit with agencies, regulatory organizations, professional bodies, because they also need to be in the room while you're having this conversation. These are the people who would be able to enforce that people build, based on the policy. But it's not something that anybody who wants to remain in business in the next 5 decades should shy away from. Policy has to be, at the forefront, and of course, everybody has to work together to ensure its actualization.
Thank you very much, Amy. I think it's important that, what you said in terms of getting people educated and understand that it actually makes, sense to go this route. So, in that notion, I'd like to pass this to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, I know you do a lot of training, trying to educate our young professionals and established professionals in some instances on the benefits, the opportunities, the incentives associated with transitioning to net zero. So what would you say your experience has been in just trying to change the perspective of the regular Nigerian man on what sustainability means? We know in Nigeria we're plagued, with a number of problems. So oftentimes sustainability may not be so high up on the priority list of the everyday Nigerian. So how would you say your training and education is going to the young professionals coming into the industry?
Okay, thank you, Chika. I think I want to look at it from two perspectives. For every of these net zero building or sustainable building, there is system, there is product, and maybe there are services. Now, looking at the whole building system, about 60% of what you get to buy for a sustainable building or for a net zero building has to be components that are energy driven. So the irony, when we start discussing this at the level of training or conversation, is the irony of it now is you're telling them you want to reduce carbon footprint, and here you are having to import all your lights, having to import sometimes your cable, having to import your carpet, your tiles. So the conversation gets to a twist that it's concluded that one of the ways to really, really have these conversation ongoing and seriously taken is when we strengthen local manufacturing. Because if I tell you that I'm trying to design to be energy efficient, but I have to bring in my lights from France, I have to bring in my tiles from Italy, the carbon footprint of these components, adding it to my overall carbon footprint, I'm actually higher than really net positive times 10 or something. So really the conversation should be, as we look at this, which are the necessary connecting lines, connecting the dots. Manufacturing is one vital and important component, because when we do local manufacturing, firstly, we reduce the carbon footprint. Secondly, we also we make local economy buoyant. Thirdly, we keep the economic impact, compact rather. So imagine you have a project that is $1 million budget. About 60% of the budget is externally sourced. So that means you are outsourcing the job, you are buying the carbon into your own system. I mean, it's good we also look at buying renewable energy certificates, doing some carbon offset purchase, but truly at this rational approach, I'm buying a solution when I have the problem. So I'm buying a carbon offset certificate when I still have the problem with me. Yes, psychologically I've balanced it, but the problem is still with me. Those are the conversations that we keep having. And of course, when we want to empower persons, you want to tell them about what they can do in Nigeria. There is need for policy. Policy to drive and support these conversations cannot be overemphasized. Naturally, humanity does not like to be constrained, but without constraint, we cannot have growth. Without compact policy in place, all this conversation, all of us prefer to sleep all day and eat all day. But when there are exams to write, we sit up, we read. If government are saying that if you don't do this, you cannot build. I remember one of my visits to India, I went to a street in Mumbai. Almost all buildings on that street were either lead or hedge or something. I had to ask the guy, I mean, what's happening? Is it that it's so convenient? The guy said no. In India, if your building follow any of these, you have incentive in energy purchase. So that means if they're buying their own energy, $1 per kilowatt hour, you buy your own 0.8 or something. So that incentive alone, most of the developers had put it on a life cycle assessment. They are seeing the profit in time. So the profit for them makes a lot of sense. So they're encouraged. You also get discounts when you are doing your approval. So in retrospect, the policy part has driven most people that invest. And you know, in an economy like, in a developing economy, yes, government spend, but the biggest spenders are the private sectors. What's the budget of Nigeria? I mean, our capital expenditure compared to the real estate budget of just VI, Victoria Island, in this year. So you look at it, the primary drivers are private sectors. All the government needs to do is put up policies that can give a direction to this investment, to the end that when we look at 2050, when we were all signing, 2015, when we were signing the Paris Agreement, Nigeria was there, 107 countries, but after the agreement has been signed, all that we want to see as a country is what are the benefits, but what are the responsibilities we're not willing to take. So I'll conclude by saying manufacturing needs to be taken seriously for us to even have a glimpse to the possibility of net zero. Secondly, policy cannot just be what it is at the moment. And thirdly, also, there is need for active engagement, active knowledge sharing. I mean, so it's not just about campus learning or something. Within the built environment, I had to engage a lot of architects, QS, builders. They don't know what to do. I met with designers that you see they are modeling, they are sampling, they are sizing, trigger a lot of waste. Because if designers are aware at this stage, we are not only saving the environment, we're also making money for the company itself. Thank you very much, Chuka. I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's something very important that you mentioned in terms of having almost 60% of a development being sourced overseas. And I see oftentimes in a lot of the projects that I manage with Turner & Townsend that the contractors, you know, oftentimes segment the local portion from the imported portions, and the way that ratio is split is always heavily in favor of the foreign portion. So I think it's a cue to come to you, Mr. Caesar of ITB, as a contractor. What would you say can be done in order to reverse that ratio and ensure that in any development you're doing, the local portion is higher than the imported portion? And as well, what are some of the blockers that you see in achieving some of the sustainability targets like LEED or EDGE that you set for yourself?
First, indeed, most of the items we use are imported. Recently, we did a project which was gold certified, LEED gold accredited, and like 90% of the material was imported. And it is an issue. The footprint is high when you transport such material. However, as in Nigeria, most of our projects are being accredited or certified based on standards built in other countries like LEED, which was originally initiated in the United States, EDGE, BREEAM, well, all of these standards will impose some materials which we cannot find in the market. Local sourcing, you can do wood, concrete, gravels, but any aspects of MEP or new technologies should be imported, unfortunately. So I think the best way is to work with the government and the specialists to build a Nigerian code, which is should be a pioneer one for the African countries and especially Nigeria, where we can use some potentials, existing potentials, that will reduce this importation.
Thank you very much. And I feel like for the duration, I know we're about to wrap up, for the duration of this conversation, it's almost as if we've painted a gloom picture. So I'd like to end on a high note. There are incentives to making this transition, you know, and there are incentives to developers as well. And what we're seeing with the surplus stock of office space, sustainability is actually becoming a differentiator. We know a lot of the global blue chip clients, you know, before they take up tenancy in any building, they're asking the questions on what are the operational costs, what are the certifications in terms of sustainability that this has. So I suppose, Anne, in 2 minutes, as a developer and also as a landlord, I suppose, do you see sustainability as a differentiator in terms of real estate and attracting tenants?
The simple answer is yes. You know, sustainability is certainly a differentiator. So developers that will absolutely be able to charge the premium for the real estate based on evidence of carbon reduction schemes that, you know, so if you think about it, the whole development process, including the materials, the construction, the certification, those are some of the expectations of many organizations in the past. I think it was focused on blue chip entities who are looking for grade A buildings, but I think now generally, typically, most people would look at that. But I think, sort of flipping it a little bit, corporate tenants are prepared to pay that premium because they have a longer term view on life cycle costing. They are able to think about, well, if I'm paying that premium now, I know that I'm sitting or living in an efficient building, and you know, it's that whole life cycle costing that they will take on board. The maintenance, the repairs, and both reactive and responsive are the things that contribute ultimately to the sustainability of the building. So as the developers are built, or the contractors are building, they're obviously thinking who will occupy, what will the occupants want or do, what will be needed, and how long will they be staying in the building. I'll also touch on leases, negotiating leases to guarantee energy performance is also a contributory factor. You know, we have an increasing number of grade A buildings in Nigeria. I mean, Lagos in particular has seen a witness of that. And a lot of those buildings have all the LEED certification. If it's not LEED, it's IFC or it's BREEAM. I mean, I don't know BREEAM is much in Nigeria, but they have some certification of the other. And they are required to include provisions in the lease clauses that are negotiated so that, you know, there are guarantees, you know, towards energy efficient buildings. The other thing that I want to sort of touch upon is the fact that in post-pandemic, post-COVID, as we move towards the future of work and the fact that a lot of it is hybrid working, you find that we've got an increased supply of commercial offices out there, and the ones that will survive, the grade A buildings that will survive, are the ones that are sustainable, because they're the ones that people would want to live and operate from. And you know, it already means that the organizations that will use them are ready to have ticked the box around sustainability. You know, I mean, I think really at the end of the day, it is definitely it is definitely a differentiator,
yes.
And I think the more we get sophisticated around our building use and occupation, the more we will have clear formulas that define that differentiation.
Thank you very much. And let me just use the opportunity to thank everyone on the panel for their very astute contributions today. And I think in conclusion, what we can say that for assets to be future-proof, we definitely need to work on the transition. So thank you very much. I suppose we don't have time for questions, do we? Okay, so thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much for a truly packed and powerful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think the things that stood out for me is the fact that the journey to net zero is not a Western ideology. Rather, it's a collective responsibility to save the planet. So we must all work together to save the planet. Then again, it's beautiful to see and also quite inspiring to hear that the Standard Chartered Bank is already actively ending single-use plastic. So we encourage more corporates to set net zero targets to help us save the planet. Thank you very much for a truly insightful and impactful conversation. Can we applaud the panelists as they exit the stage? Thank you. Thank you.